Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. My apologies for my recent silence here on BookTube. I've watched very little YouTube, I haven't responded well at all to comments, and I haven't made any videos either. Instead, I travel south to care for an elderly relative I love very much. I don't want to go into details here in this public place about that situation, but I will say that it's been both a little sad and also full of complications for me. On top of that situation, several relatively minor issues came up that required my immediate attention, and that has contributed to my absence here as well. For right now, I am home with my family in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and my plan is to try to make a handful of videos in the next few days since this outlet and this community brings me great pleasure and deep joy. So many of you reached out to me in the last week or so to make sure I was okay and to offer support, and I can't thank you enough. What I've been going through, watching someone I love go through such difficult times as her body begins to close down, is something that is intensely human and absolutely universal. And this year, on top of all the deaths from cancer and heart disease and other chronic illnesses, and accidents and violence and suicide and everything else, many people have died from COVID. As many of you know, if you've watched a lot of my channel, nearly 30 years ago I had a very large but non-cancerous brain tumor. Almost 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. And 3 years ago, my husband David, who some of you have seen on this channel a few times, was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. His particular kind of tumor comes with an average life expectancy of perhaps a year, and the percentage of people who live more than 3 years with this disease is tiny. What is amazing is that he is not only still alive, but still doing very well, working full-time from home along with many of the rest of us as a health policy expert, and leading a small federal agency until a new political appointee is named. Nevertheless, his kind of tumor is not one that people survive. All of these experiences, from my own brain tumor when I was barely out of college through David's diagnosis, as well as the deaths of many people I love, have of course made me think a lot about mortality, my own and other people's. And as a reader, my way of learning about things, but also my way of dealing with things emotionally, is to read books. Reading books about illness and death is not necessarily a sad thing. Instead, it often makes me feel more comfortable with what happens or what will happen to all of us mortals. I mentioned in my last video before my little break here that while I don't exactly hide any of my reading choices, I don't always mention them here. I will link to that video below. In it, I made the flippant comment that I might come clean sometime soon. When I said it, I definitely didn't mean it as a cliffhanger, but a few of you pointed that out to me, and David pointed it out too. That is, although I'm certain he knew what I was talking about, he wanted to make sure I was aware that I had given that cliffhanger impression. So I am coming clean today, at this moment when some of the reading feels quite immediate to me, with the discussion of 2 books in this somewhat hidden genre, both of which I read this past week. While I was down visiting my elderly loved one of the books I took with me was A Very Easy Death, Simone de Beauvoir's memoir about the death of her mother. She writes a moment-by-moment account of her mother's final days, and somehow, even in the most mundane details, readers can see not only her mother's personality and how it might have changed over the years, but the whole of the author's relationship with her mother over time and with her sister as well. There are 2 ideas in this book which I'd love to mention here. The first is that de Beauvoir's elderly mother was not told what her illness was or what her prognosis was. She was, in fact, not even told she was going to surgery. Instead, she was lied to, told that she was going in for scans. Completely aside from the fact that I find this kind of behavior absolutely unethical, it was a decision that de Beauvoir recognizes in the end to be hurtful to her mother. At first, the family and the physicians make that decision in order to preserve the mother's sense of hope, her sense of joy, as the pain of her joy tag might put it. But the promise of hope only came at the expense of honesty and truth. Immediately, Simone felt a separation from her mother, but she thought she was doing the right thing and continued to think so as long as her mother was feeling relatively strong. At some point, when Maman began to realize that she was in fact dying and wanted to talk about what was happening, no one would allow her to do so. They tried to reassure her that it wasn't true, but she knew what was happening in her body, and so did they. The author starts to recognize what they've created. She says, "At the time, the truth was crushing her, and when she needed to escape from it by talking, we were condemning her to silence. We forced her to say nothing about her anxieties and to suppress her doubts. As it had so often happened in her life, she felt both guilty and misunderstood." What Simone de Beauvoir writes here applies in cases where the patient has indeed been told the truth, but is nevertheless being pressured to, quote, stay positive. Instead of offering what might clearly be false hope, or only talking about the good things, wallowing a bit in what is actually happening can open up relationships and make our connections with each other much more deeply meaningful. It can even make life, even when it's ending, seem that much more joyful in that deep way that transcends simple pleasure. The second issue is kind of related, I suppose, although I didn't realize it when I picked the book up. A Very Easy Death was a perfect choice for maybe Midrash, the month where many booktubers read books talking about religion in serious ways. Although Simone de Beauvoir was not religious, her mother was a devout Catholic. In the early days of her final illness, family members kept priests out of the room, worried that if they came in, their mother would know that her end was near. But after her maman did in fact realize she was dying, she had no interest in seeing a religious guide. She did not ask, and even when offered, she repeatedly declined. She didn't even want to see her own crucifix or rosary beads stored in her bedside table. She said she was too tired to pray, that, quote, God is kind, and that he would forgive her. And yet she continued to work the crossword puzzles in her little book. Aware that readers might think that her mother was not actually as deeply religious as she had claimed all her life, the author explains, if she had looked upon prayer as nothing but a mechanical droning, telling her beads would not have tired her any more than doing the crossword. The fact that she did not pray convinces me, on the contrary, that she found it an exercise that called for concentration, thought, and a certain condition of soul. I really love this, an analysis done by a secular daughter that really treats her mother's belief with respect and seriousness. Okay, just one more note. The translation I read was made by Patrick O'Brien in the 1960s. And at times it feels a bit stilted. If you understand French well enough to appreciate the original text of this book, I might recommend that you try it. O'Brien's translation is fine and conveys a kind of direct revelation that I found to be quite powerful, but still, I kept suspecting that de Beauvoir's actual words might seem more, immediate. Let me know if you've read it in French or plan to read it in French in the future. The second book I read last week was a new UK publication, The Madness of Grief, a memoir of love and loss by the Reverend Robert Coles. Coles is a vicar, and he also has been quite the media darling for a while now. He's also a former member of the hit duo from the 1980s, the Communards. As the author biography at the end says so charmingly, Coles is the only vicar in Britain to have a #1 hit single. Since he's a vicar, this book also seems appropriate for maybe Midrash, and since he's gay, his memoir seems appropriate as a warm-up for Pride Month as well. In fact, although Cole talks quite a bit about his faith and his position as a vicar, I think the book has more interesting things to say about gay life during the late 20th and early 21st centuries than it does about religion. The main subject of The Madness of Grief is about the death of Richard Cole's partner, David Coles. David had been a vicar himself, and he was still quite a young man when he died in early December 2019. When our mutual Twitter friend shared Richard's first post about the death of his spouse and how he intended to balance the sharing of his grief with the need for a certain kind of privacy, I recognized something and I started following what he wrote. And it was sad and lonely and lovely and generous. Ironically, that hit single he recorded in the 1980s, Don't Leave Me This Way. This memoir in some ways shares a tight time frame with Simone de Beauvoir's book, but there are some differences. She writes primarily about the days that lead up to her mother's death, thinking of what it means to her, but also what it means to her mother. Coles, on the other hand, does describe the days leading up to David's death, but the account is much more focused on how Coles traveled through the next few weeks. David died shortly before Christmas, and although the book has both flashbacks and a few flash-forwards, in general, Richard Cole is writing about the handful of days between David's admission into the hospice wing of the hospital and the few days following his funeral. This book doesn't have the same kind of power or the same depth of insightful discussion of de Beauvoir's book, but it feels so authentic and immediate that I'm really glad I read it. As I mentioned, I especially appreciated the discussion of gay life in Britain as Coles came of age, from coming out in the early 1980s to losing a former partner to AIDS, from his dating life as a vicar to his negotiations with both his partner and with the Church of England about same-sex marriage. Still, I wonder if this book had been held for a while and then revised following a little more time after his partner's death, if Coles could have said something more lasting than I think this book will be. Well, I think that will be it for today. Soon, I want to talk about 2 more grief books on my Up Immediately shelves, and perhaps I'll talk about a few of the books about illness and grief that have meant the most to me over the years. But first, I think it's time for some more cheerful posts, and I hope I can put one up in a day or 2. Thank you all so much for being here with me today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.